Well, I hope you enjoyed the break from a really long disembodied voice segment and the chance to look at one artist in more detail. I'm posting a discussion board, discussion starter about Caravaggio, and I hope you'll participate in that. But now I'm afraid I have to move back into download mode because there's a great deal that we need to get through. As I mentioned, I've now written the test for this unit. It is long. It is hard. There are a lot of works you need to know. Also, I guess this is a warning, I'm not going to give as much information in the test review podcast. You're going to know what works you're going to need to know, and I'll give you some of the questions to look at. But I think I need you to take more initiative looking at the works and thinking about what kinds of questions the College Board is likely to ask. We're getting a lot closer to the test now, and it's kind of the home stretch where we all need to knuckle down. Anyway, enough of that. In my second lecture for this unit, I talked at length about El Greco, one of my favorites, but I didn't really address 16th century Spain. In geopolitical terms, that was Spain's golden age. Spain had evicted the Moors, it had conquered much of the New World, it had spent its newfound wealth building magnificent monuments and fighting Protestants all over Europe. Well, the gold from the New World brought runaway inflation, and the religious wars depleted Spain's treasury without obliterating Protestantism or even, in the long run, preserving Spanish rule over the Netherlands. But rather ironically, it was the 17th century, the 1600s, the Baroque era that we're looking at now, the years of decline, that brought the greatest flowering of Spanish painting. So that's where I'm heading now. But first I wanted to go back to the 1500s. I wanted you to see Philip II's great palace, actually a combined palace and monastery. This is the Escorial. And here is the image that appears in your textbook. It's from an 18th century painting. We don't even know who the painter was, but it makes the Renaissance features somewhat clearer. So you see the dome, you see the attached columns, the Greek-style pediments, and this very severe style, by the way, reflected Philip II, who really longed to be a monk and became very ascetic later in life. But again, perhaps ironically, it was the long run of his grandson in a period when Spain's wealth and power declined that saw this great flowering Spanish art. Philip IV's court painter, and among the greatest painters of the Baroque era, was Diego Velazquez. Velazquez did the best he could with some rather unpromising material. Philip IV had a particularly exaggerated form of the Habsburg chin, something that shows up in portraits from his family all over Europe. So the painter basically chose to steal our attention away from that unfortunate face by painting the king's elegant clothing in superb detail. This period of art, really the High Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance, the Baroque, is the high point of textile painting, back before photography really took away the excitement of rendering textures in such exquisite detail. So here's an earlier work by Velasquez. It's not one that's in your book, but you're braced for this question, right? Whose influence do you see? I assume you all chimed in Caravaggio, and that's often going to be the answer in this period. And I hope after my Caravaggio blitz that you see the resemblance. What do you see? Well, there's the pronounced chiaroscuro, trending into tenebrism, emphasis on shadows, the open construction that spills off the canvas, the choice of a scene involving ordinary people in an event of everyday life, although, as we just saw, Velazquez's subjects will more often be the royal family or Spanish nobility. So, this is a harder question. How does Velazquez's painting style differ from Caravaggio's, even this early in his career? Well, although we see some tenebrism, it's much less pronounced, and Velazquez employs more gradations between light and dark. He really anticipates some of the experiments with black and white photography in the 19th century. So here's another famous work by Velazquez that doesn't appear in your book. It's just one I particularly love. Again, the Caravaggio influence is really obvious. In fact, I would say that Velazquez's Bacchus bears a startling resemblance to Caravaggio's Boys. Again, we see that more graduated chiaroscuro, but still that dramatic light focused on Bacchus. And we see the open composition as the painting moves toward the edges of its frame and beyond. Do you see any resemblance to Caravaggio in the theme of the painting? Well, this is a mythological and not a biblical scene. Caravaggio pretty much did the Bible. But it seems to me that here again we have the world of the gods dropping down into the lives of ordinary people. But as is commonly the case with Velazquez, we're not entirely certain what's going on here. Is Bacchus really there, or are these revelers so inebriated that they think one of their fellow partiers has turned into Bacchus? Velazquez loves to play with ambiguities, to play with the viewer's vision, and we're going to see this when we get to his most famous painting, Las Meninas. But first, let's look at these wonderfully evocative peasant faces, often done with strong, obvious brush strokes. This isn't one of these painters where you can't even tell where he painted. He makes his brush strokes obvious. I'm going to talk about that more in just a minute. We're going to see a similar portrait style, the bigger brush strokes, the grinning faces, the peasant faces, when we get to the Dutch Baroque portraitist Frans Hals, and that he, by the way, is a College Board favorite. So here we move from a quasi-genre scene to the formal paintings of the nobility that became Velazquez's trademark. This painting commemorates a Spanish victory over the Dutch. And to fast forward to my lecture on Dutch Baroque painting, I should note that the Dutch win out in the end and managed to gain their independence from Spain. It's interesting, though, how the two generals are portrayed. They're really portrayed as belonging to the same world, sort of professional soldiers who are demonstrating good sportsmanship. The Spanish general in particular is being portrayed as behaving generously toward his opponent, gracious. The Spanish nobility was fiercely Catholic and fiercely proud, and this painting captures the way Velazquez's patron wanted to view his reign. The Dutch would probably have disagreed. The 80-year Spanish wars in the Netherlands were cruel even by the standards of the age of religious wars, which raised cruelty in war to a new level in Europe. By the way, this was Spain's last great military success. The Dutch won this town back a few years later, and they did eventually manage to expel the Spaniards from the northern Netherlands, what became Holland, though not from Flanders, the southern Netherlands, what became Belgium. Notice, by the way, the splendidly foreshortened horse in the right foreground. We're going to see more and more equestrian portraits. They're going to become popular in this era and in the era that will follow, the neoclassical paintings and romantic paintings of Unit 11. We get a break with the Art of the Americas in between. Okay, this is one of the most famous paintings in art history. And so I just went through the AP exams for the last 16 years, writing your Unit 9 test, and I was startled to discover that this painting did not show up in any of the big image-based questions. Now, I don't know if it was in internal questions in AP tests that haven't been released. In other words, one of those questions where there's an image and there are 3 or 4 questions associated with it. I would guess almost certainly that it does. But this is not a reason to ignore this painting or to skip over this part of the podcast. I think the fact that it has not shown up as a major image-based work for 16 years suggests it's one you should know. It's overdue and could very well show up on your test. So, in this painting, where is the light coming from? So look toward the middle back of the painting, and you see an open door. That's actually a very important personage. It's the Prime Minister of Spain, Velazquez's direct patron, and he is bringing in the light. So we actually see the light source, but again, it's a little bit mysterious. Now, I really hope you watch the Khan Academy podcast on this important painting, because I'm going to have to skip over it too quickly. But let me just note that it's a more mysterious painting than it appears at first glance. And again, our art historians talk about this on the podcast. And art historians are still debating what's going on here. It's kind of a painting about a painting about a painting. But are the king and queen watching Velazquez, who's painting at his own eagle, easel paint their daughter? Is the princess looking out at her parents, reflected to us in the mirror, or is she looking at us? Notice the shout out to Jean Van Eyck's Arnolfini marriage. So here are a couple of details from the painting. We see Velasquez wearing the mark of nobility. What's interesting about that is he doesn't actually get this order for several years after the painting. He wanted it very badly. This is an aristocratic culture. Velasquez was not from an aristocratic background, but he craved entry into that group. The couple in the mirror are pretty clearly the king and queen. How do I know that? That chin is a dead giveaway. So the little princess is clearly the painting's central figure. Note how she's bathed in an almost theatrical spotlight. But I think it's her dwarf maid of honor who is the emotional center of the painting. Velasquez has imbued her face with such dignity. This is a woman who has not let a deformity defeat her or define her. I think she's one of the most spectacular portraits in art history. So what do you notice about the brush strokes? Look especially at the little princess's sleeves. Well, they're broad and easily visible. Art historians use the term loose to describe this kind of brush stroke. And hint, hint, this term will show up on your unit test. The paint is actually laid out quite thickly. That's a technique known as impasto, done partly with a palette knife. And basically it refers to paint applied so thickly that brush and palette knife marks are evident. It's especially characteristic of Dutch Baroque painting, which we'll see in the next lecture. And in general, for these last few units, you should pay more attention to brushstroke technique. Painters are moving away from an effort to make the brushstrokes essentially invisible, as you see. In the High Renaissance, you really have to look to see, very hard to see where Raphael or Leonardo's or even Michelangelo's brushstrokes were. That is not the case. Painters are more willing, if you will, to display their technique. Well, that was too little time with Velasquez, but I have to move on. So Zurbarán was a contemporary of Velasquez, and he's best known for these sort of darkly religious portraits, often showing pain or suffering or martyrdom. This is a very popular theme in Catholic painting, which is often quite dark. If you go to the Prado, you will see more gloom, doom, torture, death, and martyrdom than is easy to take in a single day. I recommend doing it anyway. It is a great museum. So this painting is typical of Zurbarán's style. So it reflects this austere Catholic piety that was also part of Philip II's attitude toward the church and his willingness to go to war and basically spend Spanish treasure to try to stomp out Protestantism. You see, again, Caravaggio-esque, deep contrasts of light and dark. This one clearly has tenebrism. Notice, though, the sharp edges and lines. This painter does not use impasto. He does not blur his lines. By the way, this saint preached to the Muslims, which was a pretty much guaranteed pursuit of martyrdom. Just to emphasize again his sharp use of line, but to show also the vivid use of color in some of Zurbarán's paintings. This is The Birth of the Virgin from 1630. It's not in your textbook, but it's one of his most famous paintings. You saw, I hope, a podcast of the martyrdom of St. Bartholomew, and did you note that the podcast got the title wrong? Ms. Jacobs sent me an email about this, and she was quite right. But at any rate, to return to the painting, and I hope you did watch the podcast, in the painter Ribera paints with a much softer, more blurred line than Zurbarán, even though their subject matters are often very similar. You, I hope, got right on the test, this quiz. That was from yesterday, that the concave and convex shapes of the body, the sucked-in stomach, the ribs sticking out. It's kind of an echo of Baroque architecture, where alternating sort of curves and sunken places and flat and rounded surfaces are very characteristic. The somewhat busy Baroque architectural style. And by the way, Ribera's portraits of women in particular tended to employ this softer, more romantic line. Another portrait that's not in your book, but I want you to see more of this painter's work. Okay, on to Flanders and to Rubens. I haven't made much secret of my enthusiasm for Caravaggio, and I'm going to admit it, I am less excited by Rubens. For much the same reason I find Baroque ceilings a bit much. But I'm going to try to get over it now, since Rubens is a very important painter, and certainly in technical terms a very accomplished one. So Rubens trained in Italy, and you really see the influence of the High Renaissance and of Venice in his works. Venice in the color, High Renaissance in particularly the sculptured details of the body, although particularly the women's bodies end up having a very characteristic Rubenesque, if you will, abundance. At any rate, Rubens returned to his home of Antwerp, which was in southern Netherlands or Flanders, and worked for the court of the daughter of Philip II of Spain. So the Elevation of the Cross, which is shown here, was one of his first important paintings, and it very much shows the Italian influence. This painting is important for its composition. So notice, for example, well, actually, let me ask you, what kind of lines, what kind of composition do you see? Well, you see a couple of very strong diagonals. In the center, you see that diagonal moving up to the left, formed by the cross. On the right, you see a diagonal moving to the right, formed by the baton, the hand of the soldier, and his head. This creates a sense of movement, of dynamism that's very characteristic of Rubens' painting and of Baroque painting in general. Notice, too, the way he's made the scene continuous across the triptych, which isn't always the case. The figure on the bottom left, a typically Rubenesque full-figured woman, draws the viewer into the painting because she seems to be kind of spilling out of the canvas, and that would be the eye level. We also see this foreshortened horse and the figure pulling up the cross, who I think, again, that about to topple into your lap effect is very strong there. So this is another example of open composition, very typical of Baroque painting. By the way, note those huge muscular bodies on the men. They very much echo Michelangelo, whereas these fleshy women are characteristic of Rubens. In fact, Rubenesque is an adjective sometimes applied to women who are abundantly endowed. So what do you notice about light and color in this painting? Certainly light is used dramatically. Again, remember the word that drama is probably your operative term in Baroque, and particularly, again, think of spotlighting in the theater. But how is the use of light different than, say, Caravaggio? Not as much darkness in general in Rubens' paintings. Partly he was just a much more cheerful soul. Rubens had a good life. He made a whole lot of money as a painter, was a successful diplomat, had a fancy country villa, was received at court, basically with the status of a nobleman. He was an international art superstar. So he's simply a much less gloomy painter. He's also what is sometimes referred to as a colorist. And again, you see the Venetian influence here. Lots of use of light, lots of use of color. Yes, you're seeing a contrast between light and dark, but nothing like as strongly as you'll see in Caravaggio or, looking forward, in the Dutch painters such as Rembrandt. Okay, and just another interesting detail. Boy, we just keep coming into the Laocoon, don't we? Our favorite Hellenistic sculpture. But it's quite clear that, this was an extremely influential sculpture. Remember, it had only been uncovered within the past 100 years when this was painted. And, artists traveled to see this. This was part of the grand tour for artists. So you see the similarity of the torso. I've mentioned this before, but there are really a lot of parallels between Baroque art and Hellenistic art, especially Baroque sculpture. Think of Bernini, but I think in Baroque painting as well. So you see the drama, the movement, and the portrayal of human bodies under extreme duress, a much more emotional approach. Again, this reflects the Counter-Reformation, also kind of the Hellenistic reaction against classicism and what seemed like its excessive calm. Oops, I made a mistake here on my PowerPoints. I will fix that in the PowerPoints, but I'm not going to try to fix it in the podcast. This is, in fact, the consequences of war, not the elevation of the cross. This is what happens when I copy a slide. This section of the Low Country, so fix this. Consequences of war, fix this on your notes, and I will fix the PowerPoints that'll go into Moodle. So this section of the Low Countries remained under Spanish Habsburg rules I'd mentioned and remained loyal to the Catholic Church. So Rubens was not only a court painter, he was also used as a diplomat. And he witnessed the horrors of the wars of religion firsthand and really kind of fit into the can't we settle our differences camp. I am not going to repeat the excellent Khan Academy podcast on this work. Let me just note that this is another very important painting that has not shown up in an AP image-based question for more than a decade. Again, this one would be a very logical candidate, and it's a work you should know, especially by its correct title, not by Mrs. McConnell's bad labeling. So again, note the extreme sense of movement, the dramatic and rather light use of color, sometimes described as coloristic, although this is a darker painting than the one we saw before. The full-figured ladies, the use of mythological symbols, and Rubens really is one of those painters you should be able to identify by sight, even if the painting goes unlabeled. And as I said, the painting is darker in theme and color than most of Rubens' paintings, but his style is unmistakable. So this one does show up on your unit test because it shows up on a recent AP test, and you'll be hearing from one of your classmates about this work. It's one of a cycle of paintings commissioned by Marie de Medici, the Queen of France and regent for her young son, Louis XIII. She was fighting to keep control over France. She lost that fight, by the way, to Cardinal Richelieu. But these paintings were designed not only to celebrate her reign, but to bolster her political position and to show she had a lot of money. Rubens was not cheap. So Anthony van Dyck was a very famous pupil of Rubens. He trained under Rubens and then followed him into royal service. And in particular, he was court painter to Charles I of England, a Stuart king. And he's best known, Charles I that is, for getting his head chopped off during the English Civil War. So this artist knows who's paying the bill. Notice the regal stance, the arrogant glance at the viewer, the kingdom stretched out behind you. But it's also an unusually casual pose for a king. This is not the king charging into battle. It's the king relaxed, enjoying himself. Van Dyck, by the way, will have a very important influence on English portraiture. We'll see a lot more English portraits in Unit 11. This is really a transitional work between Baroque and a style that we will, again, in Unit 11, call neoclassical. And we're going to see a lot more still lifes in the lecture on Dutch painting that's going to follow. But Clara Peters is a female Flemish artist. I always think you should pay attention to female artists. The College Board loves them. And these still lifes of food and flowers put together were known as breakfast pieces, and they were very popular with the rising middle class. Notice how they also provide an opportunity to really showcase the technical genius of a painter. I mean, look at the light reflected off that goblet or metal object in front of the dried fruits, the extremely exquisitely rendered flowers, and you see some other breakfast pieces. I love the one with the cheese on the upper left in the slide. Okay, we're going to move really fast in the next lecture through French and English Baroque, and then I hope we can slow down to a somewhat more leisurely pace to enjoy the wonderful world of Dutch Baroque painting.